Fantasy!
Fantasy is a genre that involves non-existing and existing things that are very together to create fantasy. There are two types of fantasy, high fantasy and low fantasy.
Low fantasy is closest to reality, but still a type of fantasy with non-existing things. Animal Farm is a form of fantasy. It has animals which are part of reality, but the characteristic that makes it low fantasy is that they can talk.
High fantasy is an extreme and more imaginative version of low fantasy. High fantasy is typically what you think of when you think of fantasy. This is because high fantasy has the extreme unknown imagined things that are not real.
Most of the time, high fantasy is very dramatic and over the top, because it is trying to create something different and abnormal to our knowledge of what we know. Some things that are common in high fantasy are dragons, monsters, fairies, witches, and much more.
Why read fantasy? There are no limits, and the fun and creativity has no boundaries. Nothing has to be realistic. The story could be about anything and as crazy as you want it to be. Fantasy makes you want to keep reading and expand your imagination.